Uh-oh. Can't hear you again. I'm so sorry.
Oh no,
There
my
we go. Okay,
great.
now I hear you. Yes.
Hello
Okay.
and welcome
Sorry, that was a
everybody.
super dramatic start to the live stream. I was like, oh no, I can't hear.
Welcome everybody. As usual, I'm Steffen. Welcome to another attributed session by Dream Letter. As usual, we're talking all sorts of stuff relevant to B2B marketers, and this particular topic today is something that I'm super interested in, both as a founder and a CMO of a company, which is competition. How much should you stress about it? How much should you not stress about it? Should you follow the competition? Should you not look at it at all? And I think the guy on LinkedIn with the most qualified CV of all to talk about this is you, Andy, who you've been running even a newsletter on this topic for the last 3 years or so. So I'm super excited to have you here, Andy, and I'm really looking forward to dive into this whole conversation. But for people who've never come across your LinkedIn profile like I have, maybe can you just give a quick summary of what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, I'm Andy. I've been in competitive intel for a few years now. And really competitive intel, when I'm thinking about it, it's from like the angle of like a product marketer as in like how they do competitive intel. Because I originally started as a product marketer and I'm actually back in the product marketing seat now. I just made a switch a couple months ago. But yeah, really like my background is just I started working at a company called Zoom Info about 6 years ago, and I started as one of the first couple product marketers. But as the company was growing, it went through an IPO, a few acquisitions. The product marketing team grew a lot from just the initial two that were on the team. And so whenever that happens, it gives you an opportunity to kind of niche down into different areas. And I really loved competitive intel. And I found that I was decent at it, and the company seemed to really respond well to the stuff that I would put out and share. And so I really kind of doubled down on it, and so really built out the program there, and then went over to a company called ClickUp to build their competitive intel program. And after a couple years there, moved on to a company called Apollo, where I'm here. What's Andy's last name? McCotter-Bicknell. Yeah. McCotter is my original last name, and then my wife is Bicknell, and so we
Got
just
it.
put them together, and now our kids are going to have the world's longest last name. Sorry, just addressing the comments.
Ali
And
is.
now I'm
I know my colleague Ali is listening, so drop a link to his LinkedIn URL, and people can go connect there.
Yeah. And now I'm at Apollo. So I originally joined Apollo about a year and a half ago, and for the same reason, I was to um, put together their competitive intel program. And now I decided to make a pivot because I saw some really cool stuff that Apollo was doing specifically for their AI offering. And I was like, oh man, I really want to get involved. And luckily, there was an opening for some product marketing support. And so I'm kind of making the pivot now. But yeah, that's the long and short of my background.
That's fantastic. If I just talk a little bit about my own founder story, I think it's been in the beginning when you start a company, you feel like, hey, we can compete against everybody. We can do this, we can do that, and you kind of feel like everybody's our competition because our product is so fantastic. But over the years, you come to realize that a lot of the adjacent categories doesn't really matter. You shouldn't really talk about them in sales calls because it's not what your customers care about. And I think nowadays we're much more like narrow-minded about who do we actually care about and who don't we care about. For us today, I think very much who we care about is the comparisons that our customers mention in sales calls, but
Mhm.
and not really anybody else. Of course, it's a different story when you talk investors and the vision and where could the product go potentially in the future. But on the day-to-day stuff, what's on your website, what's on your sales decks, at least that's to how I've understood or how we're working with competition today, is that it's something that matters for the present. um
Absolutely.
but Andy, maybe,
Absolutely.
what is, yeah, maybe can you do like a simplistic fly into this topic and then we see where we go from there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so competitive intel, the way I kind of think about it, I I think that it can actually be a touchy subject, especially when you think about it like from like a LinkedIn perspective and like how people talk about competitors. I think really the trend that I see on LinkedIn and how people talk about competitors it can come from a really defensive place, and it can come from a very ignorant place where like, oh, I don't have competitors, number
Yeah,
one,
sure.
or it can
Yeah.
also be, um, I don't want to focus on competitors. I want to focus on customers. That they'll pit it against something that is obviously very important. And then the other piece too that people will say is just, oh, I don't, your competitor isn't an actual vendor. It's the status quo, like
Hmm.
this mysterious status quo, which is, I understand where that's coming from. But again, I think the place where people pitch that is, I don't want to actually do the deep work of understanding like who the other vendors are in the space that are trying to actively pursue my similar, ideal customer. I want to just like put it off and say that I'm going to focus on like the status quo and understanding that. And I don't think that that's really the healthy way of going about it. It's totally okay to get a sense for who the other vendors are in your space, what their offer is, and most importantly, what your target audience actually thinks about that offering. If they're attracted to it, if they're already using it, if they're very familiar with it, how it's different from like what the other offerings are. And I usually try to think about it in terms of like customer research and competitor research. They're actually two sides of the same coin. You can't deeply understand your customer without understanding who it is that they're considering, who they're evaluating. And at the same time, you're not really understanding your customer if you're just focusing on the competitive landscape without them in mind.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of how I see competitive intel fitting in our like B2B SaaS world. But yeah, that's kind of the gist, the summary. And so however you want to take that, yeah.
That's a great start, Andy. So where does this, let's call it intel or these insights, where do they typically end up within the companies that you've been working in? How is it utilized?
Good question. So I think historically, and this is a kind of how I think competitive intel has shifted over the past 5, 6 years. Historically, it was really one of those things that you only really talked about like at the executive level or even the board level, and everything else, like it'd be pretty hush hush around the entire company, like sales, marketing. Everyone would kind of have a different kind of understanding of like really who your competitors were and how you were different. There wasn't like a consistent talk track to get everyone on the same page. And I think, have you seen those like the Martech 5000 reports that come
Yeah,
out
yeah,
every
yeah,
single
yeah,
year?
yeah, yeah.
I think that's a great uh, kind of just side piece, like just to kind of support this point that I'm trying to make. It's how it grows every single year, just like crazy. It
Mm,
started off, I think maybe in like 2010. It was just a few hundred Martech solutions, and now
yeah,
it's like 10,000,
yeah. I think it
right?
is.
And
It's even 20,000 now nowadays or something like
20,000,
that. Yeah,
sure. Yeah, yeah. And we're seeing all these reports of all these different, like SaaS sprawl. There's so many different tools out there, so many different options. Like it's harder to 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 buy at this point, I feel like, than it is to sell software. It's like it's very overwhelming.
yeah. Hmm.
And so now it's like very critical to get everybody at a company on the same page about, hey, who's actually out there that is making noise, that is trying to get the attention of our customers, and what are we going to say about them? Like, what are the things that we can say that are going to land with our customer, that's going to resonate with them? And so that's where I feel like competitive intel has shifted at this point. Like in 2025, it's about not just like bringing in the right insights, but it's about enabling the entire organization and making sure that everyone is on the same page as it relates to the competitors you care about and how you differentiate from them.
How many competitors is a healthy state to monitor? And can you only have your top three, or can you monitor a top 20, or how many should you like? What's the volume that somebody should care about?
I'm going to give the most boring
Yeah,
non-answer ever right now, and that is it depends.
yeah,
Okay, so
sure.
at Apollo, I think that because we're an all-in-one tool, like we play
Yeah,
in
yeah.
multiple different
There's a
categories.
lot. Yeah,
If we took just like every single vendor that was in each of those categories, we would have hundreds, maybe even thousands of technically competitors.
yeah,
But we really only focus, I would say, on like 5 to 7 that we know are especially relevant
yeah.
for our target audience. At ClickUp, it was even less. I think it was probably like 3 companies that were like our tier one competitors that we knew like had been in the space for a while and that were very well known. But then there was a really long tail of other vendors that we believed were innovating and we wanted to keep an eye on them.
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily as much for like enablement for the sales team. I think that's the other piece that's really important too. For your business, obviously it depends what categories you're playing in, but it also depends on your go-to-market motion. So, for example, if you are in a sales-led organization, you're primarily just selling through demos. Your sales team is like the way to get into your product and buy. Then you're probably going to have fewer competitors that you're going to have to worry about, assuming that there's going to be other, sales-led companies in your
Yeah.
category as well. But once you open the floodgates into the PLG world and sales-led, it really opens things up into, just like a very challenging place to where you don't really know who you're competing against,
Mm.
especially like on that individual user level, because it's so easy to jump in and try a product
Yeah.
and it's really easy to churn. And
Yeah.
so you have just kind of like this conundrum of like, okay, well, who should I be paying attention to? And that's a tough thing. Like I struggle to kind of figure that out too, and like how to balance things out. Sometimes it's just on vibes at the end of the day. It's like who do I feel in my gut like
Yeah.
is actually making waves and doing innovative stuff. And I think that makes it really important for the competitive intel practitioner to be really clued into the industry, the market, and know like what the really important things are that's happening and the trends, and just like being really close to that to be able to make that decision.
Yeah. And I can imagine the salespeople also being a little bit all over the place sometimes if
Yes.
there's a like a group of 200 competitors that you sometimes have to kind of position against while you're going on the fly on a demo call.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing too is, and this is another kind of tip for any product marketer or competitive intel practitioner, is trying to put together enablement, because inevitably you're going to get a seller who's going to say, "Oh my gosh, like I just ran into this random competitor on a sales
Mm.
call.
Yeah.
What do we know about them?" You're going to look at the competitor and you're going to be like, "Who is this? This is just like a random startup." Like clearly, like you're going to kind of do your research and like how can you inform your seller, to like with this like you're only one person, you don't have the bandwidth to like just like do whack-a-mole on all these different competitors. And so what I always try to recommend is try to think of different competitors in almost like different buckets, that you can like lump them into. It could be like by similar product type, it could be by similar company size, it could be by funding. I don't like again, it's up to you, but like try to come up with different like ways that you can position against any of these competitors that are in this bucket. So
Mm.
think of like different strengths and weaknesses, different dismiss points. And then you can kind of just copy and paste at the end of the day. Like you don't always have to create like this very unique, one to one. You don't have to spend like 3 days on every single competitor, like building out like a massive formal doc against them. It's okay to find what works, like what talk tracks work, and just apply them to different situations, different competitors that might, fit similar molds as other ones. I've tried that and it definitely saves me a lot of time.
Yeah, I guess like being a practitioner of competitive intel, I guess there's also there must be like a fine balance of you must have some sheets or documents that are enormously long, but when you want the organization to actually act more informed based on these, I bet you can only land 2, 3, 4 points per competitor.
Yes.
So kind of what is the, yeah, probably interesting to hear what's the essentials of a competitive doc, and then
Mhm.
how do you then actually serve that to the organization in an eatable manner afterwards?
Absolutely. I actually just talked about this on a separate podcast a couple of days ago.
Nice.
Because one of the stories that I shared there, and I'll share here too, is I used to really pride myself on putting together really long, really in-depth battle cards.
Yeah.
Just like trying to throw as much information in there as I could. And one time I was actually like sitting down with a seller to kind of review the battle card, and I was really like feeling good about it, and I showed it to them, and I was like, "Yeah, so like, what do you think about this?" And their response was essentially like, I'm not gonna read like any of this.
Yeah.
I really only care about like this, and this, and like just like shared like a couple pieces, and it was like 10% of the battle card that they said they actually cared
Yeah.
about, and immediately deflated my ego. But it was a really important takeaway because that meant that like, okay, now moving forward, I understand like what's really actually critical for sellers when it comes to tactical, like actionable battle cards. And the things that I've found that have been especially important are number one, understanding when a competitor is primarily brought up. Like for example, like when does competitor A typically come into the conversation? What are those things? What are the things like actually that are important to the customer that they're starting to evaluate that specific competitor? The other piece is differentiators. How are you different from that competitor? And again, for that specific use case, it doesn't matter if you have a feature that the competitor doesn't have if it's not important to the customer. And so you really have to hone in and understand like, okay, for that competitor, who are they primarily selling to? What's their main use case? And when are they brought into the conversation? It's only within like those bounds that you can actually understand what differentiators would actually be important to a buyer. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is probably the most underrated or the thing that I see the least on battle cards, and that is how are you similar to the competitor? Because we're always trying to talk about differentiation, how we're better, and all those types of things. But especially if you are an upstart and you are trying to make a dent and there's like a bunch of other category leaders, whatever, you have to understand that change is very hard um, for any kind of buyer. And especially if they're like very familiar with a way of doing things, if they are already embedded in a specific work stream, you need to kind of ease those concerns
Yeah.
and talk about, hey, like you're used to these things. Totally. Like we're on the same page as you. Those things are really important, and we do all of those things. But what we do differently is A, B, and C. And we found that the way that you can, we found that incorporating those things just gets you a better result, X, Y, Z results that you wouldn't otherwise get with this piece. But making sure that you can, ground it within still this realm of familiarity and ease of use. And it will just help ease that transition of trying something kind of different. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that that's really important too.
Is there is this different whether you are in a, let's say, a niche where you're kind of is an established niche where you're kind of replacing an existing product with another,
Exactly.
as opposed to if you're, let's say, we don't have any competition because we're so new.
Mhm.
In that situation, do you have to kind of like make a bridge to what they have today and then bring that over to what your new solution is?
Oh my gosh, yeah, I'm definitely talking about, more you're in a specific category and you are trying to, um, either take customers from other, competitors, or you're trying to just, like, bring more awareness to your solution as an option. Um, if we're talking about, like, we don't have any competitors, my guess is that the more, like, formal mindset would be, like, somebody's trying to create a category. They're trying to create a new way of doing things, they're trying to identify a new problem, and so it is less so about talking about, like, similarities in that case, and it's more about trying to, like, really accent and bring awareness to this problem that maybe, you've identified as the vendor and
Mhm.
is pervasive within your industry, but maybe the buyers they haven't formally identified yet. It might be like one of those like phantom pains that they they are experiencing, but they can't really put their finger on like why it's such an issue. And so, yeah, if you're creating a category, you are trying to approach this from like a non-competitor's perspective. That would be more the approach
Yeah.
than trying to talk about similarities.
Yeah. Cool. Can I ask you to go a little bit deeper into, I don't know, I guess, like, let's say the to-do list of here's a competitor. What are the XYZ dots that we need to kind of checkbox here before we can say we know enough about the competition?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I typically try to do, and I'm actually going to open up my Notion page right now because I've kind of figured out like we what we have at Apollo is
Mm,
essentially like a competitor's DB where
yeah,
okay, like here are all the competitors that that we really care about,
yeah,
and here's all the information that we want to share because we feel like this is like why do we feel like they're competitors
Yeah.
essentially? Like that's the other piece. And this is a part of enablement and a part of what I feel like is like this like product marketing-itized like version of competitive intel where you are trying to bring the information into one spot within the company that's
Yeah.
accessible by everyone.
Yeah.
And so within our competitors DB, we talk about the competitor. Then we
Have you
talk about
actually have you put that out on your blog at some point, or like a sketch of that? I'm sure people would be hungry for that.
that's a good point. I don't think I've shared too much about it. I'm always like a little bit concerned about like sharing too much about like, like what like I'm specifically doing like within my company.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Obviously,
like
there's
so
some
I always need to think
proprietary
like
data.
because I had to think like, okay, how can I like templatize this into a way
Yeah,
that's like
exactly,
digestible for
exactly.
everyone? So that's a good point. I probably should in the future. But the way that I kind of organize things in our DB is there's rows of competitors, and then there's I would say about 6 to 8 columns
Yeah,
that we found is really important to us. And when I say us, I say like our executives, like they're bought in and they say these things are important. It's not just me as a product marketer throwing different pieces of information out. The
yeah,
important thing is you present this information to your executive team, your sales team, whoever is most important,
mm,
and they like confirm, yes, this is important information and can help us determine if a competitor is important or not. For us, it's use case because again, we play in multiple categories. So use cases first, and then funding, market cap slash valuation, annual revenue, total headcount growth year over year. And that's important because it tells you if a company is like really hiring, they're getting a bunch of traction, or if they've had layoffs or things
yeah,
are kind of messy behind the scenes. Um, Mentions in sales calls in the last quarter. And we do that on a basis of percentage. And so we can see if a competitor has been mentioned in 20% of calls or 5%. There's a big difference, obviously.
yeah.
And then G2 comparisons in the last year.
Nice.
We invest pretty heavily in G2,
Yeah,
and a lot of our category does as well. And so by nature of that, we're able to kind of identify really from the user's perspective, like how are they thinking about Apollo relative
yeah.
to our competitors? And it's really interesting data at the end of the day. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we think about competitors.
And yeah, I'm curious because this is something we try to get better at. So the use case bucket, what would be the typical things you put in there?
Yeah, so we and this is again specific to Apollo, but we have essentially like 4 solution areas that
Hmm.
we've identified.
I
Like when
see.
people come to Apollo, they're trying to do one of 4 things. And for us, that's generate pipeline, win and close a deal, enrich data, or even just use us as a light CRM. And
Mm.
so out of those 4, those are our 4 main use cases
Yeah, I
that we've
see. I
identified.
see.
Yeah.
Cool. 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 It's funny. I was actually expecting you to just raffle along a feature comparison when you had kind
Oh,
of
really?
here's the competitors, here's our features. Is
No,
that
no,
not
no,
part of it?
no. Like so we do have like some forms of like feature comparisons, but that's usually like within our actual sales battle cards
Okay.
and in some of our landing pages, like on our website, because we do some competitor ads, and when you click on it, then it'll take you to a specific landing page versus a
Yeah.
competitor. So yeah, we have some feature comparisons. I'm always like a little bit wary of feature comparisons, and
Mm.
I think it's the thing for me is it really just again depends on the persona. For most people, I don't think that they want anything that's like more than like 10 rows of like different features.
Yeah.
But there's definitely like, if you get into, like an RFP or a really technical buyer, like
Mhm.
they want to see all of those rows. And
Yeah,
so it really
absolutely.
depends on like who you're selling to.
That's a super interesting avenue or kind of like a side trade to the competitive intel that there's the general overview which you described now, but then there's kind of how do we utilize it? It can be a
Hmm.
battle card that you give the salespeople that they can train on. So whenever they hear the mention of this competitor, they should start remembering a few of those things. But it's
Yeah.
also the landing pages of this. If you're trying to rip and replace another vendor, you want to take
Hmm.
them to a landing page where there's relevant information about this case. Actually, just anecdotally, in my past company, not Dream Data but Air Team, we were ranking 1 in the US on our biggest competitor's name, and
Yeah.
we started starting to receive letters from the lawyers saying, "Take that page down, stop,
Yep. It
stop
happens.
writing stuff there."
Yep.
How much have you? And how much have you seen of that kind of? I think
All the
what I
time.
learned from that was that, at least in Denmark, where that business was based, it is that anything you write has to be objectively verifiable true
Yep.
in order for you not to lie
Yeah.
on that page.
Yeah, there's definitely some things, like, if you're going to put together a competitive landing page, to make sure that you watch out for. Number one, yes, they have to be like objective truths. If you're going to say that a vendor doesn't have a feature, you need to, you know, make extra sure that they don't have a specific
Yeah.
feature. And you should also, what I would try to do is just add like a little date at the bottom of that feature comparison. And you can say, like, last time we
Smart.
audited this was like December of 2024, something like that, just so that like it's extra clear. It doesn't have to be a super massive, it could just literally be an asterisk. The other thing that you should watch out for is um, 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 we mentioned the objective truths. Trying to, gosh, there was
I think
one
it was
other thing
great
that I was
just putting
thinking of.
that date, because that relieves some of the pressure where you can always refer to,
Yeah,
we checked here, we couldn't find anything.
yeah. The other thing I thought of is try to. I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to have like if you're going to go this avenue and you're going to put effort into competitive landing pages, you will no doubt at some point get some kind of outreach from a competitor. It's just kind of a matter of time.
Yeah.
And so like when that happens, like listen to, like, don't be a jerk about it,
Yeah.
like make the changes if it's untrue, like hear them
Yeah.
out. And like, because at the end of the day, like everyone's kind of trying to do the same thing, and it makes it really really challenging if like you start being a jerk and then other people start being a jerk.
Yeah.
And so just like have that tight feedback loop with your legal team to make sure that like they're keeping you in the loop on like what's okay, what's not. And before you make any changes, make sure you pass it through them. I know it's
Mm.
kind of like a not like super like move fast and break things answer, but that is my recommendation.
We have to be decent people at the end of the
We
day.
do. Yeah. Absolutely.
What are some of so now we've talked a lot of, which mainly talked about sales use cases so far for the competitive intel.
Mhm.
What are the things you kind of talked with marketing teams about when it comes to competitive intel?
For marketing, it's mainly about positioning and messaging and making sure that like what we're going to market with isn't overlapping like on a, like a one-to-one as what like our competitors are saying. Especially like if you are you know, coming out with like a brand new launch or like this big tier one launch, it has to be different. Otherwise, it's going to fall flat. Something has to be unique. Something has to be like kind of spicy about it. Otherwise, yeah, like how is it going to stick? And so that's my big like usually recommendation is trying to get a part of that like launch process. If you're like revamping a new homepage or if you are coming out with a brand new feature that's going to be like a big splash, you know, make sure that somebody in competitive intel is looped in, or a lot of people don't have a dedicated like competitive intel person.
Mm.
If you are just like a product marketer and you're trying to like make it all work, just try to get a sense for like, okay, our top 5 competitors, what do they say about this thing? And is it important that we say the exact same things? Like, is this just kind of like a checkbox, like parody
Yeah.
feature
Yeah.
that like
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
need to just like everyone has those? That's totally fine. Or is this something that's going to be like different? That's going to be a big splash, and like how can we convey that in a better way? And the way that I typically like try to approach that is just, and I know this is one of those like generic but true answers. You just got to use the voice of the customer. You have to really just make sure that you are talking, like get like qualitative data to understand what is this offering actually giving our customer? What like pain is it relieving? Like how is it resonating with them? And try to use those words as much as possible. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
we've been doing that more and more. Like we record all our calls in Gong, and
yeah,
like for example, when we've been building a few persona pages, we try to find these personas on Gong and then listen to what are actually the words that are coming out of the mouth of these people, and then sometimes you can even just take that one line and put straight up as
Totally.
the hero text on the website. So if your company is
Absolutely.
not recording calls right now, do have a conversation with the sales team about figuring that out. The same thing
Absolutely.
for tracking how often the competitors appear. You can build like trackers for brand names on those calls, so you can go and see how often do they appear. If there's one that appear more than another, maybe that's the first
Yeah.
one you should care about, and not the other one.
Hey, actually, so on that point, something that I've actually been thinking about quite a bit is really just like how so many companies at this point, they have names that sound like words that we use in our everyday language. Like when I was at ClickUp, right?
Yeah,
One of the main competitors is Monday.com, but
yeah,
people will say just Monday.
yeah,
And okay, well, how can I make a tracker for Monday? People say that all the time.
yeah.
Another vendor in the space of Apollo is a company called Seamless, and
Mm.
that's a word that you
Yeah, very
use in like everyday
you
language. You know
seamlessly
what I
use.
mean?
Yeah,
And so when you're in, your call recording tool and you're trying to put together a tracker, try to think of other ways that you can track this actual word if it's one of those words that's used frequently, like
yeah,
so for monday.com, make sure that you're tracking .com with that word. Make sure that you are including like with Monday, or using Monday, use Monday, like those kinds of like variations instead
yeah.
of just
Smart.
Monday. In fact, I think there's a way for you to add to a tracker, like don't don't track it if it says on Monday or next Monday. So there's things that you can do to kind of improve the accuracy of those trackers, and so that's just something that I've tried to implement over the past couple of years.
Well, that's super good advice. What are the things that when you're kind of you probably ask questions about competition all the time. What are the things that people think wrongly about, or something you could wish you can change people's awareness about?
Um, I think that I already kind of touched on a couple of like what I consider like less intuitive pieces of advice. Like again, like the status quo piece. I think that people like really just kind of like are ignorant about tracking competitors and how you need to have kind of a point of view. Like your customers are going to be happy that you're thinking about competitors. Your investors are going to be happy that you're thinking about competitors, and so that's one thing. The other piece was obviously like thinking about how you're similar and not always just different.
Yeah,
Let me think if there's anything else that's like really like big and top of mind. The other thing that I will mention, because we talk about feature comparisons a lot, and like how, oh, it might not be like super useful for your customers. But at the end of the day, right, as a competitive intel practitioner, we have multiple customers. We have our actual customers, like the people that are buying our products, but then we also have the people that we are creating or that we're building out this intel for, which are like our fellow, teammates, our marketers, our sellers, our product managers. And actually, I do think that there is quite a bit of merit in building out a really extensive feature comparison table for your product team so that you can understand not just like, hey, like we don't have this, we need to go build it, but just like, hey, in general, like what do our products look like? Like what directions are we going in versus our competitors? It's not necessarily like meant to be like, hey, we need to have everything that they have. It's
yeah,
really just to understand, like I mentioned, like how are our products different? What directions are we going? And does that mean that we want to continue down the path that we're going? Do we want to fill in some of these gaps? If they filled in some of our gaps, what would we do? It just is a good way of like stoking that conversation. And so for feature comparison specifically, I do think that there is quite a bit of value in creating them and maintaining them if you have the bandwidth, especially if you have like a really good rapport with the product and engineering team.
super nice. Have you been in a situation where you have had aggressive competitors or even kind of malbehavior competitors, and how should one
that
react?
was that was probably us actually a couple of years ago. We were probably
Yeah,
the malbehaved
I
competitor,
mean,
but
we
we've
have
toned things down.
yeah, we have competitors that write to the people who review us on G2. We have
Oh, really?
competitors that tell us lies about us, and we have
Really?
competitors that run ads that are with statements that are not true about our product and stuff
Mm.
like that. Like, how should one kind of how do you maintain the the balance when you see people acting in a way that you wouldn't necessarily act yourself?
Yeah, it really just at the end of the day, it depends on how impactful you feel like that activity is, that commentary is. Yes, there are definitely vendors that speak negatively about Apollo or might even be taught like using inaccurate information. And what it always boils down to, so I can actually speak to a very specific example. So one was we one of our sellers got they received like a like not like anti Apollo collateral from a competitor's seller. How do I want to say this? A customer that was evaluating Apollo and a competitor,
Yeah,
they sent our seller like, hey, like this is like what they said about you type of a thing.
yeah,
And so we were looking at the collateral and we were like, oh my gosh, there's so much uh false information here. Like what do we
mm,
do? Do we
yeah,
reach out to the vendor? Do we like try to correct this? And what we ended up landing on is that we're not going to actually say anything to that vendor. We're going to actually take this as an opportunity to say, hey, none of this is true. And here we're going to show you that it's not true. And you should actually use this as a signal that you probably shouldn't trust this vendor that's speaking this inaccurate
yeah.
information. Like that should be a signal that it's probably not the best decision. And sure enough, that resonated with the customer at the time, and they went with Apollo. And it's funny, I have a community for competitive intel practitioners, and before I made that decision, I actually asked the group and I was like, hey, like if you're in this situation, what would you do? Would you like say something to the vendor
Yeah,
or would you not say anything? And everyone unanimously said, don't say anything.
yeah.
Like just try to like show like that it's not true, like from like your point of view, and it'll end up working in your favor most of the time.
How do people find your community, Andy, if they want to join after having listened to this conversation?
Oh yeah, sure. So it's healthycompetition.co. The community is called Healthy Competition, and it's for competitive intel practitioners, or if you're a product marketer that's like trying to dabble in competitive intel, that type of stuff. Yeah, you can just do that. Healthycompetition.co. I would have gotten the .com domain, but I'm
Yeah,
not
too
that
expensive.
wealthy. So
Nice. But let's go a little bit deeper into this. How do you make sure kind of the intel doesn't end up in the hands of your competitors then? Because like sales team will be, sure, we got this comparison doc from Andy, let me just show you. And then they ship that over that PDF and now the competitor is looking at it.
that's the thing. Most of the best competitive intel, it's really not super secret. It's really at the end of the day, it's just very curated and like tightly positioned so that it can best help whoever is using it. So for a seller, that's a certain it's those points that we mentioned that I try to include in the battle cards. Um, if it's the product manager, then it's like those like feature comparisons that I try to put together. But at the end of the day, like I think we're really stepping away from this idea of like competitive intel being this really secret, kind of profession. And it's really just more about being deeply embedded in your market, knowing kind of what resonates with your buyers and being able to help put that into the hands of the people that it matters the most. And so if your competitor gets access to, some of those details, then like, okay, like it shouldn't, I don't know. Like I know how a lot of our competitors are positioning against Apollo.
Yeah.
The whole point isn't to like stop it from happening. It's to succeed despite all of that stuff happening. So it's a
Mm.
little bit of a tricky mindset, but yeah.
That's super interesting. Because like we have customers as well asking, how do you compare again XYZ? And then
Mhm.
obviously we've prepared some internal documents that are not really like groomed enough to be shared with like the public, but
Yeah.
somehow they find their way to the customer and then they get shared back and forth. And then we see the vendor also replied something to the document and stuff like that.
Oh, geez. Yeah, yeah. So if it's like, okay, so there's definitely a couple of different ways to think about it. There's definitely like internal only assets where it's like, yeah, if you have like specific like pricing details that you don't want a competitor to get their hands on, or like like how you discount and stuff like that, that's a tough thing that sometimes you can't help that getting out. You just have to have like really specific and strict rules with your sales team and just make sure that they know like, hey, here are the things that are internal only. Here's the things that you can share. And so just making sure that all of your content is tagged in that way. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, some people are going to just like take screenshots of stuff and send it out.
Mm.
But you have to do just
Yeah.
like everything that you can to make sure that it's very abundantly clear what you can and can't share.
Yeah. Maybe just referring back to something you talked a bit about earlier, the feature comparison. Can you give some pointers on how to do that well? Because you can go to someone's website. Sometimes you can try the product, sometimes you can't. Then there's review sites like G2 where you can try to study the details. What are kind of
Yeah.
the ABC of trying to stitching together kind of a feature list of whatever the competitor do?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Typically there is a help center or a knowledge center, and it's public facing for vendors, especially if you're in like more of a mature category. You should be able to access public facing information that shows you more tactical, specific, like non-markety
Mm.
details about a product. And that's usually what I refer to when I'm trying to put together a feature comparison. And I try to break it up into a few different sections. It'll be the features itself that like help you just like help solve, the jobs to be done that each of like the buyers are trying to, accomplish. And then I'll also break it out in terms of like admin, reporting, settings, like that type of stuff, integrations, and then compliance, security, accessibility, support, and then pricing. That's usually how I break. If I'm doing like a full offering, like how do we compare with other competitors? Those are typically the categories that I'll look at, and you can find the majority of details within somebody's knowledge center or help center, and that will also help you avoid some of like the marketing speak, and because as
Yeah.
marketers sometimes we talk about things in more highly more optimistic ways than maybe it really should be talked about. But help centers are you're able to kind of get to like the cold hard truth of like how uh, do they actually have this capability? If so, how strong is it? How capable is it? How does it compare to ours?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I was thinking on a slightly different question, but I'll just pull up Aces here. So she's asking, are you using agents to pull this information? And my question was, are there any tools that you utilize in this process to kind of continuously map the different features?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of different like AI specific workflows that I've added into gathering competitive intel.
Ooh.
One is more for like qualitative data, and so there's a really great. This only really works if you have a really good G2 presence or if your competitors are in G2. But if they are, there's tons of really great information within a review. What people like, what they don't like. And so if you go to a website called Appify, they should have an agent called G2 Explorer,
Mhm.
and it should be pretty much free. If not, it's like cents on the dollar to just scrape a handful of reviews from a certain time period. You can take those reviews and then just export them into something like ChatGPT and just talk to it and be like, hey, like what are the strengths and weaknesses? What are like the primary like things that people are talking about when they're referring to the competitor, referring to us? What are like the company sizes so you can get a sense of like the customer base? So that's one thing that I do. And then in terms of like pulling, stuff from a help center, that's a little bit trickier, I've found. Um, Whenever I try to do some kind of like big pull or scrape from a help center to try to like map to different features, I found that like it is a good start, but it's not something that you can trust right away.
Yeah.
This is why I think it's extra important that whoever is doing competitive intel, they have to have a fundamental understanding of the landscape that they're working in and like really like what they're actually working with.
Yeah.
Otherwise, yeah, they could like just see like whatever like ChatGPT or whoever scrapes and to be like, all right, look cool, looks good. But again, I think that there's some truth to it being able to like kind of give you a head start and give you something to work with. But I would not just use that. I would use it as a place to start and then go and verify or validate and then go from there.
Yeah, I'll just do a +1 for the G2 reviews. I mean, it's immensely helpful just having all of your own G2 reviews in a GPT, so you can talk with it. Say,
Yeah,
what are the
absolutely.
features that we should be looking to improve? If we have this feature and we want some words that describes it, like why not utilize all the reviews that your customers have already been using?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, that's a great one. And then there's also the ability to like kind of um, like talk to like the customer conversations that you have in sales calls as well, like taking like the transcripts and exporting them into yeah, something like
Mm.
ChatGPT, or even a lot of these conversation intelligence tools like Gong, like Apollo actually has one too, that you have like a natural language interface where you can just kind of like ask questions about a handful of conversations, and you can get some pretty good insights from them. It's pretty
Mm.
cool.
Super nice. If you look to the kind of the state of the art competitive research, kind of, or the future even, kind of, what are the next kind of trends do you think we're going to be seeing? Is it all AI agents, or is there any other things?
Um, so I think in the future, there's going to be more of an emphasis on hiring people that are going to be supporting competitive intel, and that's just because of how, again, like to reference like the Martech, you know,
Yeah.
5,000, 10,000, 20,000. There, it's just so easy to start a company today, and
Yeah.
that's by virtue of AI. That's really like ramping things up. It is so easy to just create a product and start building. Like we're seeing all of these different companies that are like 10, 15 employees, but they're getting tens of millions of dollars in revenue. It's just crazy what's possible today. And so, yes, I think that it's especially important to have somebody that is dedicated to keeping a tab or keeping a pulse on the landscape and being able to report on the most important things that are happening and what it means for the business. I do think that there's going to be significantly more improvements in understanding, or excuse me, in building out like AI agents specifically for
Mm.
competitive intel, because we're just not there yet. I think that like there's been plenty of like, oh, I want, like, if you go to like, I always try to keep track of this, but like Agent AI,
Yeah.
that's like one place where Dharmesh, the CTO of HubSpot, he's creating this kind of like new like social network
Yeah.
almost for agents. And it's really, really cool, by the way. Everyone should check it out, agents.ai. But there's some competitive intel, agents on there. And I was curious, like, okay, like how do these do? And in every single situation, it is very, very generic, very, very generic competitive intel that they pull in, where it's just like, hey, like, give me the domain of the competitor, give me like
Yeah.
the like some kind of like summary of their positioning, their category, and it's like not tactical information.
Mm.
And so that's what I mean when I say like we're not quite there yet, but I anticipate that in the next year, 2 years, we're going to get significantly better at that. And so those are the two things that I think are going to be coming.
So if someone out there listening and you don't know which startup to start, then there's a room for a competitive intel startup out
I
there.
do. Yeah, yeah.
Super nice. So we're quickly running out of time, unfortunately, Andy. If we were to kind of go full circle and like start from the beginning, if people have been inspired by this competition talk, what are kind of the main things that people should look at to make do like a quick improvement, time to value on this topic?
For competitive intel, I think that the main things that you should do if you are trying to build out a program is a few different things. Number one, I think you should just start talking to customers like immediately. Out of everything, talk like getting onto a help center, looking on G2. I still think that talking to a customer is the most important thing that you can do for your competitive intel program. Talk to people who have evaluated you against a competitor. Talk to people who are currently using a competitor. I think people are freaked out about doing that, but you can literally just DM somebody on LinkedIn that you know is using a competitor and be like, "Hey, I would love to learn." Like, be upfront. "Hey, I work for
Yeah.
this company. I saw you use whatever competitor. Like, I would love to like talk to you for like a half hour just to learn, and offer an incentive if you want. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. People might call you out. One time, I got called out for like, "Oh, like Apollo's like looking into like this area. And I was like, yeah, so what? Like, that's literally what you're supposed to be doing, talking to customers. Don't worry about that. That's number one. Number two is make sure you're talking to the right people within your company to make sure that you're actually delivering the insights that are actually important. It's one thing to be like delivering competitive intel and just like throwing stuff in like your competitor's channel on Slack. But it's pretty easy for that stuff to kind of get ignored. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of activity happening within a company. And so, you'll kind of get the sense like, is this actually valuable? And so talk to your VPs, if you're able to talk to like the CEO and try to figure out what is the stuff that they really care about, and like the stuff that you've been producing, is it like on par, or like how can you level it up? That's two. And then the third is yes, Sam called out for doing my job. Yes, I literally was. I was like, bro, do you know? Like, number three. And number three was the distribution model for your competitive intel. Because again, I do think that the big core piece about this function is not just gathering the information for yourself, but making sure that everyone else has access to. So whether that's building newsletters that you're sending out every month, making sure that you are constantly adding to the competitor Slack channel, making sure that you're just really keyed into like what each department is doing, making sure that you have those like kind of distribution methods really set up, and working on a consistent basis. That would be the third thing that I would highly recommend.
Super nice, Andy. So last round before I let you go. So if you get that customer or that user of a competitor on the call, what are the 3 questions? If you can only ask them 3 questions, what are the questions you're asking?
Yeah, so I always try to use there's a really great book called The Mom Test that I always try to refer to when I'm talking with customers or prospects. And the real big takeaway from the book is to ask open questions, not direct questions about like, hey, if we did this, would you come to us? That's like not an example of a good question. What you really want to understand is just about the customer. So like, hey, like, what were you experiencing when you decided like, hey, I need to evaluate a sales intelligence tool? Like, what was going on in your world when you started like researching it? And then talk through like, what were your evaluation criteria? Like, what were the things that this tool like needed to hit in order for you to be able to like move forward?
Super nice.
Sometimes it's like a feature, like a product specific. Sometimes it's like a price thing. So that's the other piece too, to kind of like keep in mind. And honestly, I'm just gonna like keep it at that. Keep it open-ended, and then just like ask them about themselves and like their world and like what was happening when they were evaluating. I really like. There's like small variations in like the questions that I would ask, but it's all based around the other person and like letting them talk to me and just like so that I can get to know kind of their situation.
You're not trying to drag how you see the world down on them.
Yeah, don't push. Don't like try to share your biases with them. Like you might have your own opinion. What they might be sharing with you might be like fundamentally false to like what you know, but like it's true to them, and it could also be true to other people. And so that could inform a bunch of other workflows down the road, but it's just your job to like listen and get a sense for kind of like what they were going through and how that helped inform their decision.
Fantastic. Andy, this has been extremely wonderful. If people want more of you, if they want to follow more along what all this insights you have about competitive intel, where should they head?
Yeah, just go to LinkedIn. I try to post pretty frequently on LinkedIn. So just Andy McCotter-Bicknell. That's where you can find me. And then if you're a competitive intel practitioner and you want to talk with other competitive intel practitioners and just kind of like learn best practices and stuff, go to healthycompetition.co. We have a Slack community where people are talking. It's a little over 100 members, and you can learn more there.
Fantastic. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining in. Andy, thank you so much for your time. If you like this conversation, there's a podcast called Attributed. So go search for that where you listen to podcasts, and you'll find, I think, almost 200 more shows like this. So go there, listen to the conversations and subscribe, and we'll be super happy. And if one more time, thank you so much for your time, and I really appreciate you teaching me all these things.
Of course, thanks for having me.